Hello and welcome to College of Idaho Insights, roundtable discussion of current events of public interest. I'm Dustin Wunderlich, and today I'm joined by Professors Jasper Licalzi, Rob Dayley, and Kerry Hunter from our Department of Political Economy, and Professor Mack Sermon from our Speech and Debate program. Today we're going to be talking about redistricting and whether the United States should be promoting democracy abroad. Jasper, first off, can you give us a brief overview of what are the biggest issues that come up during the redistricting process?
Well, redistricting, anyone doesn't know, is every 10 years we have a census in the country, and the Supreme Court has said that the legislative districts, both state legislative and congressional districts, have to be basically equal. So as population changes and moves, you have to redraw the lines and do redraw the districts, so it's redistricting. So it's done for both the Congress and the state legislature, and sometimes for other places like the city council or something. Issues that come up, there's a lot more sound and fury about it, I think, than there's actual changes in what goes on. I don't think, especially if you look at Idaho, say you look at Idaho state legislature, I don't see it being that big of a change if you look at it from a partisan perspective. How many more seats are the Republicans going to get, or the Democrats going to lose, or vice versa? What's 2 more seats, one way or the other, going to make a difference? It's also, I don't think, all that, I mean, if you're in a state where it's very close and the majority might go one way or the other, so you'd have a different speaker, different committee chairs, I think it could make a difference. But for the most part, I think it's kind of a kabuki dance, that everybody is, oh, it's all in the paper. You were saying, oh, this is blood sport. And it's a lot of commotion about not that big of a change, I don't think.
I think it was back in 1980, I might be wrong, but when George Hansen, the eventual convicted felon in eastern Idaho, cut a deal. He was in the 2nd district, 2nd congressional district, cut a deal with whoever was in the 1st district to put a few more of the liberal parts of Boise into that 2nd district, and that may have been what ultimately cost him his seat.
Well, see, usually, and I think that's what redistricting isn't so much partisan as much as it's incumbent protection.
Right.
It's all the incumbents just want to make sure that they have safe seats. When it comes to Idaho and you look at the state legislature, the biggest issue you're going to have is in eastern Idaho. There's just not as many people there. Either the population increases are flat or they're actually going down. So that means there's going to be probably another district in Canyon County, another in Ada County, like in Meridian, and maybe another one up north. And those districts have to come from eastern Idaho. So then, all you get all the people in eastern Idaho saying, we're losing our representation. It's like, you don't have as many people.
There's been growth in Bonneville and Teton, Jefferson County over on that side. But yeah, a huge loss of population in Bannock County, Minidoka, Bingham, Cassia, actually a lot of the big spud country. So this is really a shifting of the population from a more rural basis to an urban basis. That's going to make a lot of people nervous. This is where I think the new voter ID laws and the new closed primary laws are going to come into play as they are redistricting, as they are considering how to make these things safer for the incumbents. This is a bipartisan commission which is appointed by the leaders of the Democratic and Republican parties, both in the House, Senate, and then the chairs actually appoint these folks. They have pretty good credentials, but I can't help but think that they're not going to look at the reduced urban voting by both school-age students, Hispanics, unionized workers with less education in some cases, and they're going to look at opportunities to shift some of those areas that are becoming more and more democratic, like in Boise, Ada County, Canyon County, and then even Idaho Falls, which has growth in that area and has been to the advantage over Pocatello, which has actually lost population. So you're going to see these places potentially be, better bedrocks for the Democratic Party, and the Republicans aren't going to like that. They run most of the state, and I think they're going to try and find ways during the redistricting process to protect.
But again, I don't
themselves.
think how the Democrats, I mean, if you gave the Democrats a map, so you draw whatever you want, I don't think they gain more than 2-3 seats. It's not gonna be like, they could draw it however you want, unless they can get rid of Canyon County and eastern Idaho, they're not gonna be even close to a majority. So I don't see it as that big of a deal. Who it's a big deal to are the incumbents who are actually in there, and they're gonna wanna protect their seats. What they don't wanna see in eastern Idaho is where you have 2 incumbents, both put into the same district. One of them's gonna have to either run against each other or one's gonna retire. And that's
Will
where
they be
it
able to avoid that?
No, you can't avoid it, but what you do is you try to say, oh, well, okay, maybe it's somebody like Denton Darrington, who's 180 years old or whatever. You put him in with someone else and he retires. Though actually, I like Denton a great deal. I think he's kind of conscious of the set.
Like old people?
Well, not all old people. Don't like you then.
I'm not that old.
Well, you're the oldest one on the panel here.
Well, one of the things that the Republican Party has been trying to move towards is a close primary. Would that have any impact on the makeup or leanings of the Republican Party in the state?
Tremendously. Ben Yasursa, the Secretary of State himself, tells the story of when his father came to America from the Basque Land, and there was a short period where they had what they called call-out ballots, which was like a closed primary, and you had to call out, do you want a Republican ballot, do you want a Democratic ballot? And Ben Yasursa's father said, it ain't none of your damn business, you know, in kind of his broken Basque. And actually, I think that's what the Secretary's opinion of this is. The legislature obviously has a little different opinion. And they talk, especially in places like Colorado, Ohio, Indiana, where they are working on these increased voter ID laws and these closed primaries. They talk a lot about not the current voter fraud that's taking place, but the potential voter fraud. And what makes me especially worried about that is they are looking at the demographics in the United States. The fastest growing demographic group are Hispanic Americans. And they are afraid that somehow, in fact, you even heard ludicrous stories on the internet of Acorn or some other organization, you know, like taking busloads of illegal aliens from polls to polls. That's about as legitimate.
That's as American as ever happened.
Yeah.
I'm from Philadelphia, Chicago. They always do that.
Back in the good old days.
But good old days, like when? Last year. I mean.
But it's about as legitimate as calling for President Obama's birth certificate.
But closed
there's just
primaries,
no proof.
they have them in the eastern Pennsylvania.
what's the big
They've had
deal
them
for
forever. It's not that big of a deal.
Who benefits
there.
by having a closed primary? I mean,
The parties.
Right, so what, in what way are you saying this is?
Well, who's disadvantaged?
I voted for Ross Perot back in the good old days.
But who's, I don't know,
had that opportunity.
who's really disadvantaged. Unless you say, I'm an independent, I don't want to be, I don't want to be associated with either party, so I don't want to vote in your primary. Well, then you don't vote in the primary, you don't have a say in the primary.
Well, the question is, does the current system really sway who gets picked as the party representatives? Are there that many Democrats or moderates that aren't identified as Republicans voting in the primary that are swaying the outcome?
And Republicans think so. See, and the argument that the party's trying to say is, this is our party. If you're going to be on the ballot in November and have Republican or Democrat, especially here, Republican, next to your name, only Republicans should decide that. That people who aren't Republicans should not be deciding who the Republican nominee is.
Well, then it's going to require a litmus test then. I'm
No,
going to
you
have to
decide.
swear
You-
allegiance to the
Hey,
Republican Party,
They
and
do
I'm going to have
this
this list of
in
things that I
Pennsylvania,
follow.
New York, all in Illinois. People, you don't have to swear, I did that. When you go to vote, there's another box there. You have to check R, D, or Libertarian, or Constitutional Party,
I'm
or
concerned
Independent.
about the voters, but I'm just as concerned about the candidates. Not all candidates want to make that choice of, hey,
They
I'm
do
a Democrat,
now.
hey, I'm a...
They
Well,
do
the only
now.
way you
Who
can
doesn't run it? Who doesn't run as a
remember-
Republican or a Democrat?
Uh,
Ross Perot, he's a crazy man.
John Anderson.
Pro-life?
Pro-life, I
Who
mean,
has no chance to get elected anyways?
Yeah, I mean, what is it really changing? I don't understand.
In political theory, the whole function of a political party is to choose the candidate. That's one of their primary functions. And what primaries do, primary elections do, is they strip that function from parties. So it's clear that they want this. I don't know if it will have a big effect in Idaho anyway. if there are few Democrats or moderates that are actually voting in those primaries. I mean, what's the percentage, Jasper, of people that actually vote in primaries anyway now?
Well, it's small, and they tend not to be all that competitive anyway. I mean, it's like, oh, it's going to change a whole lot. I don't see it changing that much anyway, because not that many people vote in the primary.
Somebody must think it's gonna.
What I found interesting is some who have thought that, hey, it's a philosophical thing, you know, that we want to decide who.
Controlled by parties.
Right, but I like, someone to talk about the idea of do like in Utah, where you have, go back to the convention system, where you have, where there's people who are chosen, and then they choose it in the state party convention, who the
That
nominees
sounds
are.
great for Senator Bennett.
I know, I mean, but that's
For
what.
Senator Hatch, evidently, it's going to work out pretty
You
poorly.
can have
I
a
guess.
problem with that too.
Seems to me this is a response to Walt Minnick's success. In a way, they think that maybe his moderate platform can draw some people. This way, they can put up a Republican candidate that can go against him. Would that have anything to do with it, Jasper?
Well, but I think if you go back, you know, the old political science folks from the 1950s with their ideas of the responsible party government, you know, more of a parliamentary style government. The party chooses the nominee. If things don't go well, you vote against them. Now it's like, okay, the economy's doing poorly, the war's going poorly or whatever, I'm going to vote against the incumbent. But wait a second, but the Republicans here aren't Republicans there, and Democrats there aren't Democrats there. It makes it hard for the people to decide. They have to decide every race instead of looking at it more from a party perspective.
The problem I have with putting the focus back on the parties, though, is that these are publicly held elections. It's the state government that actually pays for that primary election. It is taxpayer money that pays for these private entities, the Republican and Democratic Party, to have their little hoo-haws on that particular Tuesday. So if it's literally the taxpayers paying for the Democrats and the Republicans to choose their candidates.
That's why you go back
if
to
we're
a
going to do
convention.
that, I want to be able to be an independent or a
But then-
commie
but-
or a
but-
Tory or whatever.
As long as we have a single member district, first past the post kind of system, you will always end up in a two-party race.
Yes.
At the end, unless we reform the Idaho system or the national system to a multi-member districts or proportional
Which would be
representation, then we're not going to ever see a rise of a third party or independents really that can vote. It's going to be Republican and Democrat from here on out. It's just going to be that way for a long time in terms of dominance.
And even though they might be private parties, it's still a public interest to have an election. And I think I'm with Jasper. I think you can increase an awareness of who's responsible for what if parties have more control over themselves. I mean, right now, you don't know parties aren't.
See, you're like saying, oh, it's a horrible thing that they have a litmus test. No, I think it's a good thing to have a litmus test. To say, if you're a Republican, this is what you are, it makes it much easier for the voters to decide. This idea that every voter has to decide, okay, I have this array of candidates. Some have R's, some are D's, but those titles don't mean anything to who they are. I have to make it easier for them. The voters aren't that sophisticated. So you make it easier for them to not have to decide, okay, when I vote for U.S. Senator, I might vote for Republican or Democrat, I have to vote. No, you can vote for a whole ticket.
But Rob pointed out the perfect example in the state of Idaho, a blue dog Democrat like Walt Minnick, who has Republican positions all the way across the board, really could run as a Republican. That doesn't make it more clarified for those voters who are trying to figure that out.
Well, no, it makes it very
process.
difficult for them to try to. Should I vote for Minnick? Is he a Republican? Is he a Democrat? Is he a blue dog? Whatever you call it. No, if the parties had much more, much more structure as far as who's going to run. He doesn't run as a Democrat. He runs as a Republican.
Well, here in the United States, we have a long tradition of elections, but in a lot of other countries, they don't have that history. And in recent months, especially in kind of the Arab world, we've seen some uprisings, people asking for their voice to be heard. Rob, could you talk a little bit about whether America should be promoting this notion of democracy abroad, or not? What could be problematic about America promoting democracy abroad?
I think if you promote democracy abroad, does desirable to the populations that may be transitioning from an autocratic system to a democratic system. I think the problem comes in how we define democracy and what it is that we're promoting. I think if we, as Western countries or the United States, goes in and throws an election on a population that's not really, that doesn't have a political culture really suitable for democracy, and then having elections and calling it a democracy is not going to be sufficient to create more problems than not. We've seen that time and time again. So I think promoting democracy over the long run is of interest. It is an important centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy, but I don't think just.
But is democracy more than elections?
Yeah, it's got to be more than elections, and that takes a long time to develop.
So is what Obama gave this speech a week or so ago, and he seems to be trying to take some sort of a middle ground. I mean, is that the kind of thing that you're talking? Has he got the right kind of policy, are you suggesting?
I think so. I think it's pretty measured. I think he's promoting democracy, but not trying to impose it, or he talks like a liberal, but walks like a realist in a lot of ways.
That was the New Yorker.
Yeah, that's the New Yorker Lisa article. I can't imagine a U.S. foreign policy that is going to actively not promote democracy. It's too much of a core part of our values of who we are. I mean, who's against accountable government? I don't want accountable government. I want my government to be unaccountable to people. You know, and that's what you're seeing in the Arab Spring right now. People want that very thing, and their governments haven't been, and they want something. But the transition is a very dangerous thing. It takes a long time.
Well, because the U.S. did back Mubarak for the longest time, and the Arabs are angry at him now
That's
for
right.
having bailed, angry at Obama for having bailed on Mubarak. Was it in our interest at the time to support Mubarak? And I mean, is Obama just following along with changes that are happening, or should he have been more resistant to the democratic movement in order to show some sort of loyalty to former allies? And it seems like it's pretty complex.
Well, by the time Obama gets into office, the U.S. policy with Egypt has already been established. It can't come in and just reverse things overnight like that. Once the protests began, I think he took a cautious view at the beginning, but he followed the movement, and clearly at the end of the day, he sided with those that pushed Mubarak out. I think we'll see that elsewhere. The big question is Saudi Arabia. That's the real tough one.
But did Obama start this though with his speech in Cairo though? Was that a bit of a spark when he the year or so before that he comes and says, hey,
I think that's attributing too much to a single speech or what what Americans. I think you have to look at the people on the street in the Arab world. What they've been angry about for a very long time, long before Obama ever gave that speech, is the fact that they had autocrats running those countries. But they hadn't done anything about it before. Was this like a spark or How
something?
can you do much about it when the military's in your neighborhood, in your backyard, on the internet?
Well, they have autocrats running those countries who are supported by the U.S.
Exactly. That's why we should have been promoting democracy a little bit earlier. Right?
How?
I think what you do is you use your leverage, and you say you should push for accountable government with elections, with opening of civil society, human rights practices. I mean, human rights. If you just promote human rights alone, you're promoting a type of democracy. A lot of these countries don't have free speech, full free speach, and people are in prison for things
Wouldn't
that they
that
say.
undermine our very allies in those countries if you're encouraging that kind of?
A long-term view would look at this and say, look, democratic governments tend not to go to war against each other, right? If more countries become democracies over time, the more likely it is that we can have a democratic peace dividend at the end of the day. And I think the long-term strategy would support that. We do have interests. We can't promote democracy at the expense of every other priority. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I don't think a measured policy promoting democracy is kind of pushes that. Look at China. We have a lot of interest with China. We're not promoting democracy there. We tried with Clinton tried early on, and then abandoned that policy, realizing it's better to let them change from within.
Well, doesn't it have to be not a one size fits all, which is somewhat Bush was kind of pushing, I think, for the whole Middle East. Democracy is good for everybody, and how we look at democracy is good for everybody. And instead look at it at a case-by-case basis.
No, Bush was certainly supporting the Saudi government, he was supporting Mubarak's government.
But he made statements.
He made statements.
Very much
as far
Gaddafi,
as-
very much Gaddafi.
Yeah, his policies weren't really one size fits all.
Well, I would argue that the neoconservative arguments going into Iraq, where they promoted democracy, but they really had a different agenda behind that. They were using that to convince the U.S. public it was worthwhile doing. They were a little bit intoxicated after going into Afghanistan and liberating the people from Taliban. But I think the Bush administration policies going into the Middle East were about a lot more than democracy.
So what should Obama be doing now with regard to Gaddafi? Are we gonna find ourselves entangled in some long drawn out war?
I think that the approach he's using there is a good approach. It's in concert with the international community's desire. They're sending, if Obama tries to overstep his power and abuse American power to go and try to engineer the Middle East, that's exactly what the people don't want there. That's what's going to create greater problems than.
But are we gonna get sucked in a longer term kind of thing?
Of course, it's a longer term kind of thing. How long did it take for the Western world to reconcile religious practices with secular governments? It took a long time. It took Europe centuries to kind of.
But I don't think it's going to be a long military process.
Yeah, I mean.
No, and I think that's why I think it's I read Bob Woodward's latest book, to Obama's Wars, and he pushes this in with Afghanistan. So he doesn't have this long range, we're going to be there 10 years, and this is an open-ended process. He's looking at reducing how much, Obama is looking at reducing how much we're spending and the amount of troops we have in different countries, including Libya. It's very limited, because he doesn't want to spend all the money. And he says it's just not worth it. It's not in our interest to spend tens of billions of dollars in Libya.
But that's not saying that what he's doing is not promoting democracy.
But he's doing it in a measured response.
Right.
It's not like, well, okay, we've got to send in 50,000 troops because there's something going on there. No, it's a measured response on what we can do as compared to just every time we do the same thing.
But by having committed, it seems to me that it'll be hard to pull back, even militarily, if it seems like pulling back could lead to breakdown of their society and continued warfare. It seems to me that we could find ourselves sucked in militarily for a much longer time than even Obama would have hoped for.
And I think that may happen, actually. I mean, in Afghanistan, one of the biggest problems that caused the Taliban to rise was the fact that after the United States supported the Mujahideen against the Soviets, and that ended, we pulled out, and they resented the fact that we pulled out. We kind of left them and then created this power vacuum. I don't think that we're going to see a complete pullout. I think de-escalate, not kind of withdraw over time. But I just don't see a reverse course entirely.
Well, thank you all for participating in today's College of Idaho Insights, and thank you to our viewers. If you have a topic for discussion that you'd like to suggest, please email communications@collegeofidaho.edu, and have a good day.